The Seder Pekudai brings to the close all the parshas dealing with the construct of the Mishkan that in turn serves as a forerunner of the Beis Hamikdash. And it's a rather well-known story that is undocumented insofar as being linked to a particular medrash that is known by so many of us. That story addresses itself as to the choice of the exact spot of the Beis Hamikdash. The story goes something like this. Two brothers live in the environs of Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh, unchosen as yet, unspecified and identified as yet, and both of them are farmers. They're both pretty much the same age, but one is married and blessed with a wonderfully large family, many children, whereas the other brother, unfortunately, is unmarried and thus has no children. The brother who has the wonderful family, in the middle of the night, says to himself, my brother is going to be getting older, and I'm also getting older, but when I reach a ripe old age, I'll have a family to take care of me, all of my children, whereas he'll have no one. So that brother goes out into the field, he picks up a large bale of wheat, and he treks it all the way over to the area owned by his brother, and he places it down on his brother's land. Meanwhile, the next night, that same brother gets up in the middle of the night, and he says to himself, I have such a robust produce from my farmland, but I'm only one person. And as we continue getting older, my brother has so many mouths to feed, shoes to purchase, to place on the feet of his kinderlich, of his children, an education to provide. And he therefore goes over to his field, lifts up a large bale of wheat, and treks it over to the farmland area of his brother. And they keep on doing this night after night, and each one looking at his respective farm produce, wondering to himself, why, I don't understand. I should have less because I've been taking to my brother. What's going on? And one night, lo and behold, in the dead of the night while it's dark, the two of them are marching, each one respectively, towards the field of the other. And they bump into each other, each one carrying a bale of hay. And they begin to realize exactly what has occurred. And they set down the wheat and they embrace with such love and such care and such empathy and concern and compassion. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu supposedly looks down and says, that's the place where I want the Aron to stand. That's the place where I want the Kodesh HaKadoshim to be. It's a gorgeous story, but as I mentioned, there's never been a medrash found that actually states it. Well, in this week's Seder Pekudai, I found a Sfarno that doesn't mention the exact story, but I believe it can serve as the backdrop. This Sfarno commenting upon the amount of silver tabulated in this week's Seder Pekudai that was 29 and then some talents of gold. And if you convert it into present day currency, it comes out to approximately $11 million of gold. Just the gold that was contributed to the Mishkan, not including the silver and the nechoshes and the copper and all of the materials that went into the construct of the Mishkan and the Big Day Kahuna. Says the Sfarno, we have the narration and the accounting of all of the metals that were contributed to the Mishkan. And yet, even though it's a huge amount, it was considerably and relatively speaking, nothing by comparison. It didn't begin to compare to the largesse of monies and wealth that went into the construct of the first temple by Shlomo HaMelech. Unestimable wealth. V'yoser mimenu, but greater than the wealth that went into the construct of Bayis Rishon by Shlomo HaMelech was that which ultimately was invested in Bayis Sheni when the finishing touches were put upon it by Hordis. It says the Sfarno. V'yim kol zeh. And even though that the second Bayis, the second temple, was constructed with such lavishness and such unimaginable wealth, more than Bayis Rishon, and so much more than the Mishkan, the tabernacle itself, in kol zeh, with it all, Yoser hismid marek kvod Hashem b'mishkan shel Moshe mimashe hismid b'mikdash rishon. But the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of the Almighty, was so much nonetheless more palpable in the tabernacle, in the simple Mishkan of the desert, than it was in Bayis Rishon, and even in Bayis Sheni, where in Bayis Sheni we're told in the Gemara Yuma, there was no presence of the Shechina itself. Says this Svarno, Uvazeh Hora. Through this we are taught, Shalo Kitzvas HaOsher V'Godel HaBinyan, that it will never be the amount of the wealth and the greatness of the structure that goes into the house of God that will first determine Yihiyu Siba, will be the reason La Hashros Hashchina B'Yisrael, for the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu by his own decision to be found within that very structure itself. It will never be a function of the amount of money and the pledges that were collected from Klal Yisrael going in to construct the most magnificent of all edifices, but rather Avorotza Hashem es Yireyav Uma'asehem l'Shichno B'Soch. But rather Kodesh Baruch Hu looks for, and what he measures and wants to see, is the Yiras Hashem, the awe of the Almighty, and the actions of Klal Yisrael, not simply to God, but for one another, that will determine just how palpable the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is to be found in whatever house we build for him. Where does that magnificent story of the two brothers in an unbelievable, invaluable embrace come from? It's never been found. But maybe it's this Svarno, teaching us that no matter what kind of house we are to build for God, from the beginnings of the rather modest tapestries and curtains surrounding the Mishkan in the desert, to ultimately temple number 1, and Bayis Sheni, temple number 2, ultimately, Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, let them craft for me a sanctuary, and let them throw into the mix, most importantly, the way that they treat each other and the way that they turn to me through that as well. V'shachanti b'socham, and then I will first fill up the space of the building that they build for me to indeed be the grandest structure of all. Have a wonderful Shabbos.